ago. Now, obviously, Steve McQueen is dead for 30 some odd years, and it's very sad to me that as sober, grown-up, non-sexually connected beings, we didn't get to sit down and clean it all.
Ali MacGraw has stunned Hollywood with revelations no one saw coming. She's finally exposing secrets about her marriage to Steve McQueen that decades of gossip never uncovered. For years, their relationship was dismissed as a tragic Hollywood love story. But this is the untold truth of the horrors Ali MacGraw endured as Steve McQueen's wife. Ali MacGraw and Steve McQueen, Hollywood's most toxic love story. When we think about Hollywood's greatest love stories, our minds often drift to the glamorous couples who seem to have it all: the fame, the fortune, the undeniable chemistry that leapt off the silver screen and into real life. But sometimes, what appears to be a fairy tale romance from the outside is actually a cautionary tale of obsession, control, and mutual destruction. This isn't just another story about two beautiful people who fell in love and fell apart. This is a story about how passion can turn into possession, how love can morph into something dark and dangerous, and how two people at the absolute pinnacle of their careers could lose themselves completely in a relationship that would ultimately define and nearly destroy both of their lives. The story begins in 1972 on the sun-baked set of the film The Getaway in Texas. Ali MacGraw was at the absolute zenith of her career. She had just 3 films under her belt, but what films they were, culminating in the massive success of Love Story, which had earned her an Oscar nomination and made her one of the most sought-after actresses in Hollywood. She was so hot that she'd already had her footprints immortalized in cement at Grauman's Chinese theater, an honor typically reserved for legends with decades of work behind them. She was married to Robert Evans, the powerful head of Paramount Pictures, living what seemed to be the ultimate Hollywood dream. And then there was Steve McQueen, the king of cool himself, the biggest male movie star in the world, a man whose very presence on screen exuded an effortless masculinity and rebel charm that had made him an icon. But beneath that cool exterior lurked something far more complicated, far more damaged, and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined.
And then I stopped on my mark, finally, and I looked up and I went, oh my God, it's Steve McQueen, whom I knew at that point. But I suddenly realized I was working with this huge legend.
When MacGraw looked up and saw McQueen on that first day of filming, something fundamental shifted in her universe. Years later, she would describe meeting him in terms that sound almost supernatural. She wrote in her memoir, Moving Pictures, that she was obsessed with Steve from the moment he stepped into my world. There was never enough air for me to breathe to change that feeling. This wasn't just attraction. This was something all-consuming, something that would override every rational thought, every consideration of consequence, every shred of self-preservation she possessed. But MacGraw wasn't the only one feeling this electric connection. Steve McQueen later called Sharon Tate the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen, but when he met Ali MacGraw, something deeper clicked. Perhaps it was because she represented everything he thought he wanted: the successful career woman who would give it all up for him, the beautiful actress who would become what he called his old lady, cooking him meat and potatoes and serving dinner at precisely 6 p.m. while he watched television alone. Their on-screen chemistry in The Getaway quickly spilled into real life, and what began was a scandal that would rock Hollywood. MacGraw was still married to Robert Evans, the very man who had produced The Getaway and would later call casting his wife opposite McQueen his biggest mistake. The affair became the subject of intense media scrutiny, with tabloids running wild with headlines about Hollywood's steamiest scandal. By 1972, MacGraw had left Evans and filed for divorce. On July 12, 1973, she and McQueen wed in a private ceremony in Cheyenne, Wyoming, becoming what the world saw as Hollywood's ultimate power couple. Life magazine dubbed them the sexiest couple alive, and paparazzi couldn't get enough of them. They seemed to embody a kind of wild, untamed romance. Motorcycle rides through the desert, quiet moments on their Malibu ranch, a love that appeared to exist in its own beautiful bubble, away from the glitz and phoniness of Hollywood. But what the cameras didn't capture, what the glossy magazine spreads couldn't show, was the darkness that was already seeping into their relationship like a poison. Because Steve McQueen, for all his cool exterior and magnetic charm, was a deeply damaged man carrying the weight of a traumatic childhood that he had never properly processed or healed from. McQueen had been abandoned as a child, shuffled between relatives, beaten by stepfathers, and eventually sent to reform school, where he learned to survive through violence and manipulation. These early experiences left deep psychological scars that manifested in his adult relationships as an insatiable need for control, a paranoid jealousy that could turn violent in an instant, and a pattern of substance abuse that he used to numb the pain of his unhealed trauma. And now, this wounded, volatile man had found in Ali MacGraw someone who seemed willing to surrender everything for him: her career, her independence, her very sense of self. In their prenuptial agreement, McQueen included a clause demanding that MacGraw quit acting, a non-negotiable condition of their marriage. At 34 years old, at the very height of her career, with the world at her feet, MacGraw agreed. She would later call this decision one that cut off my career at its very height, but in the throes of her obsession, she saw it as a romantic sacrifice, a proof of her devotion. This was the pattern that would define their entire relationship: MacGraw's deep-seated fear of abandonment meeting McQueen's need for absolute control.
But I always thought he'd leave me. I mean, it was this absurd, I don't know what I thought, except that I wasn't real.
She would later reflect that she became only half of me, a kind of woman I thought would appeal to him, suppressing her true self, her desires, her very personality in an attempt to become whatever he needed her to be. But here's the tragic irony. No matter how much she sacrificed, no matter how completely she surrendered herself to his vision of who she should be, it was never enough. McQueen's jealousy was constant, an ever-present undercurrent that colored every interaction, every phone call, every moment she was out of his sight. He made her friends wary of calling the house due to his irritability, effectively isolating her from any support system that might have helped her see just how unhealthy their dynamic had become. Their days fell into a routine that from the outside might have seemed domestic and sweet, but which MacGraw would later recognize as a form of control and manipulation. She would prepare his meals, serve him dinner at exactly 6 p.m., dress in the jeans and t-shirts he preferred, rather than the glamorous clothes that had once been her signature. She lived in constant vigilance, always trying to anticipate his moods, always walking on eggshells, never knowing what version of Steve McQueen would walk through the door. MacGraw would later describe him as having incredible mood swings, what she called a Jekyll and Hyde syndrome, that kept her in a perpetual state of anxiety and false hope. There would be periods of calm, of tenderness, of the man she had fallen in love with shining through, and then, without warning, the darkness would return. The interrogations about her day, the accusations of flirtation, the hours-long diatribes that left her exhausted and gaslit. And fueling all of this toxicity, amplifying every worst impulse and insecurity, was their mutual descent into substance abuse. McQueen had long been a heavy drinker and drug user, indulging in cocaine, heroin, and barbiturates, often mixing them with alcohol in a dangerous cocktail that would send him spiraling into paranoid rages or days-long disappearances. And MacGraw, trying to cope with the intensity of their relationship and the loss of her own identity, developed her own addictions to cocaine and tequila. What had begun as a passionate, all-consuming love affair was rapidly transforming into something far darker, far more dangerous. The fairy tale that the public believed in was really a nightmare that both of them were trapped in, unable or unwilling to escape, bound together by a toxic combination of obsession, fear, addiction, and a kind of codependency that would ultimately consume them both. The cycles of abuse and betrayal. As Ali MacGraw and Steve McQueen's marriage progressed through the mid-1970s, the darkness that had always lurked beneath the surface began to completely overtake whatever genuine love and connection had initially drawn them together. What emerged was a devastating pattern of emotional manipulation, infidelity, substance-fueled volatility, and what many experts would later identify as classic domestic abuse tactics. Let's talk about the control, because it went far beyond just asking MacGraw to give up her career. McQueen's control was pervasive, rooted in paranoia and a deep-seated need to dominate every aspect of her life. He didn't just want her to stop acting, he wanted to dictate her appearance, her social interactions, her daily schedule, her very thoughts. He subjected her to constant interrogations about her day, convinced that any interaction she had with another man must be evidence of flirtation, or worse. MacGraw recounts in her memoir a particularly harrowing drive back from dinner where McQueen launched into what she called a jealous, rather sinister diatribe that lasted for hours. No matter what she said, no matter how much she protested her innocence, nothing could convince him otherwise. It was sick and horrible, she later wrote, describing how his gaslighting made her question her own reality, her own sanity. This is textbook emotional abuse, the isolation, the constant accusations, the making someone doubt their own perceptions and memories. A 2023 Portland Press Herald op-ed called their relationship a case study in domestic abuse, and when you look at the patterns, it's hard to argue with that assessment. MacGraw later told Oprah,
It was just It's two things. It was, why can't you read my mind about what I'd like and what I wouldn't like?
But this wasn't just about poor communication. This was about a fundamental power imbalance where one person held all the cards and the other was desperately trying to avoid triggering an explosion. She described herself as having done the sullen holdback during their marriage, being tight, inauthentic. This is what trauma does. It makes you contract, makes you small, makes you constantly vigilant and unable to relax or be yourself, even in your own home with your own husband. And then there was the physical violence. Now, MacGraw has been careful in her public statements, always emphasizing that she doesn't see herself as a victim, always acknowledging her own role in the dysfunction. But the facts she's shared paint a disturbing picture. In her memoir, Moving Pictures, she detailed an inadvertent backhand to her forehead during an argument and admitted to having a healthy fear of Steve's temper and physical strength, phrasing that some critics have pointed out sounds disturbingly like victim-blaming language, minimizing the seriousness of physical violence by calling it inadvertent. While MacGraw maintains that physical violence wasn't a regular occurrence in their relationship, the emotional and psychological abuse was constant. She described living in an atmosphere of terrifying mania, where McQueen's hour-long grillings would leave her fearful and on edge, creating an atmosphere of constant dread. And this pattern wasn't new for McQueen. His first wife, Niley Adams, had detailed far more extensive physical abuse in her 1986 memoir, My Husband, My Friend, including an incident where he held a loaded gun to her head and beat her between slaps after she confessed to a brief affair, an affair that had occurred during a period when McQueen himself was engaged in serial womanizing with various co-stars and groupies, which brings us to perhaps the most painful aspect of their marriage, the infidelity. The affair that had begun their relationship, MacGraw's betrayal of Robert Evans, set a template that would haunt their entire marriage. McQueen, despite being the person MacGraw had left her husband for, became obsessed with the idea that she would do the same to him. His jealousy and paranoia about her potential infidelity became a self-fulfilling prophecy. McQueen engaged in what friends would later describe as a parade of women, serial affairs that he justified as payback for what he was convinced were her betrayals, even though she had been faithful. He would check into the Beverly Wilshire Hotel for trysts, disappear for days on cocaine-fueled binges with groupies and prostitutes, then return home volatile and accusatory, projecting his own guilt onto her. MacGraw later admitted to one affair of her own during their marriage, describing it as an escape from what had become a claustrophobic trap. But she emphasized that McQueen's infidelities were far more numerous and destructive, occurring amid the already volatile mix of his substance abuse and controlling behavior. And speaking of substance abuse, this was the demon that amplified everything else, every insecurity, every argument, every bad impulse. McQueen's addictions were severe and long-standing, predating his relationship with MacGraw but intensifying dramatically during their marriage. He indulged in cocaine, heroin, and barbiturates, often mixing them with copious amounts of alcohol in a dangerous cocktail that would send him into what MacGraw called incredible darkness and anger states. One incident detailed in Marshall Terrell's biography, Steve McQueen, Portrait of an American Rebel, involved McQueen pressuring MacGraw to join him in cocaine use during a late-night high. When she resisted, his paranoia about her fidelity intensified, leading to another round of accusations and interrogations. MacGraw developed her own parallel addictions, using alcohol and cocaine as coping mechanisms for the emotional pain of the relationship and the loss of her identity and career. I developed a cocaine and tequila addiction, she later revealed, describing how by the mid-1970s their habits had intertwined in a toxic symbiosis of shared benders, followed by crashes of guilt and temporary reconciliation.
Well, I think what happened is that when my marriage to Steve fell apart and the public's version of my fairy tale kind of went into crisis, I did a series of movies that got badly reviewed.
The world watching from the outside saw a different story, of course. The media continued to romanticize their relationship, publishing photos of them looking beautiful and in love, perpetuating the narrative of Hollywood's perfect power couple. But behind closed doors, MacGraw was living what she would later describe as walking a nasty razor's edge between sanity and the toxic excitement of their volatile dynamic. And, through it all, she kept her silence.
You told my producers all your marriage ended for the same reason, that you never said who you really were.
Right.
And I was like, how could that be?
But, you know, I think
That is so powerful.
This is perhaps the most insidious aspect of their relationship, how MacGraw felt she had to hide her true self, her feelings, her needs, her very personality, in order to keep the peace and prevent him from leaving. She became a master of self-suppression, of anticipating his moods, of making herself smaller and smaller until she barely recognized herself anymore. MacGraw would later tell Oprah that she was tremendously insecure and dangerous, and that you never knew what he was going to do or say or be next. This unpredictability unpredictability is a hallmark of abusive relationships. It keeps the victim constantly vigilant, unable to relax, always trying to anticipate and prevent the next explosion. The cycles continued, the tender moments that gave her hope, followed by the explosions of rage and jealousy, followed by remorse and reconciliation, followed inevitably by the next explosion. Round and round they went, trapped in a dance that was destroying them both, unable or unwilling to break free. By 1977, their marriage was clearly in its death throes. The fights had become more frequent, the substance abuse more severe, the distance between them insurmountable despite their physical proximity. And yet, the obsession that had brought them together still held them in its grip, making it almost impossible to imagine life apart. The aftermath and legacy of a toxic love. The end of Ali MacGraw and Steve McQueen's marriage came in 1978, after 5 years of what can only be described as beautiful agony. The divorce itself was relatively amicable on paper. They had a prenup that protected McQueen's assets, and MacGraw waived alimony claims, later regretting the financial hit, but appreciating what she called the clean break. But emotionally, spiritually, the damage was done, and would continue to reverberate through both of their lives long after the legal documents were signed. Ironically, MacGraw returned to acting in 1978 with the film Convoy, the very year their divorce was finalized, but the momentum she had once possessed was gone. The girl from Love Story, who could do no wrong, who had conquered Hollywood after just 3 films, was now seen as damaged goods. Her subsequent career was relegated largely to TV miniseries like The Winds of War in 1983, and she would never recapture the magic of her early success.
Why? But Winds of War, and I'm probably the only person in this room that hasn't seen it.
Well,
They said you were miscast.
whatever
Were
it
you
was,
miscast? Did you know going in that you were
I don't even know, because it is this larger-than-life television nightmare for me.
The public humiliation of her career struggles was compounded by the private pain of her continued addiction. Her substance abuse actually intensified after the divorce, as she grappled with the loss of the relationship that had consumed her entire identity for 5 years.
The only time in my life I remember saying, God, I've got to have a drink, and another one, and another one. And I did some blackout stuff because it was so painful.
It wasn't until 1987 that MacGraw finally checked herself into the Betty Ford Center for treatment for her alcohol addiction. She has spoken openly about also struggling with addiction as another form of escape from her pain. As of 2025, she has been sober for over 35 years, a remarkable achievement that has allowed her to reflect on her marriage to McQueen with the clarity that only sobriety and decades of healing can provide. But here's the most tragic part of this story. Ali MacGraw and Steve McQueen never got the chance to have that sober conversation, that honest reckoning about what happened between them.
My very first husband, who I haven't seen for years, but we had a meeting that was very, very extraordinary about talking about a long time ago. Now, obviously, Steve McQueen is dead for 30 some odd years, and it's very sad to me that as sober, grown-up, non-sexually connected beings, we didn't get to sit down and clean it all. You know, because something was there.
Steve McQueen died on November 7th, 1980, just 2 years after their divorce, at the age of 50. The cause was complications following experimental surgery for pleural mesothelioma, a rare and aggressive lung cancer caused primarily by asbestos exposure from his decades of racing and his time in the Marine Corps. But McQueen's death was controversial in its own right. Faced with a terminal diagnosis in December 1979, he rejected conventional treatments like surgery, radiation, and chemotherapy, viewing them as poison that would destroy what remained of his vitality. Instead, from early 1980, he pursued metabolic therapy at Mexico's Oasis of Hope Clinic in Tijuana, embracing unproven treatments including letrial injections, coffee enemas, vitamin megadoses, and live cell therapy involving injections of pulverized sheep fetal cells. His pursuit of these alternative treatments made headlines and gave false hope to thousands of desperate cancer patients, boosting the already booming underground letrial market. By October 1980, his condition had deteriorated to the point where he needed oxygen to breathe. On October 22nd, he underwent a 12-hour experimental surgery in Juarez, Mexico, performed by a kidney specialist who was experimenting with cancer operations. He died 13 hours later from cardiac arrest, brought on by the trauma of the surgery on his already ravaged body. His last words were reportedly, "I'm sorry, I love you," spoken to his third wife Barbara Minty and his son Chad. According to friends, McQueen had expressed remorse about his treatment of Ali MacGraw in the years before his death, telling people, "I was a piece of shit admit, I was a total asshole to Ali, but he never said those words to her directly, and now he never would. MacGraw has spoken poignantly about her grief over this lost opportunity for closure. In a 2018 People magazine interview, she said, "I wish we could have grown old together sober," highlighting how sobriety in their later years might have allowed for healing and understanding. She emphasized that she doesn't see herself as a victim. "I'm not a victim in any way. There were many times that were just wonderful, and there were many times that were just ghastly," acknowledging both the highs and lows of their time together. In various interviews over the decades, MacGraw has demonstrated a remarkable ability to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to acknowledge the genuine love and attraction that existed between them, while also being honest about the toxicity and dysfunction. She has described their bond as chemical, something almost beyond their control, laced with what she called incredible darkness and anger that neither of them knew how to navigate in healthy ways. In a 2025 Woman's World retrospective, MacGraw's reflections from earlier interviews were compiled, showing how her perspective has evolved over the decades. Now 86 years old and living a quiet life in New Mexico, focused on yoga, animal rescue, and photography, she has achieved a peace that seemed impossible during those turbulent years with McQueen. But MacGraw has also been refreshingly honest about her own role in the dysfunction. She hasn't simply painted herself as an innocent victim of a controlling, abusive man, though the evidence certainly supports that McQueen's behavior was abusive in multiple ways. Instead, she has acknowledged what she called her own failures as a partner, particularly her inability to communicate her true feelings and needs. In a 2010 interview during the 40th anniversary reunion for Love Story, she reflected on why her marriages failed, saying, "I'm on my own now, but I was an atrocious partner. Most importantly, I never told anybody who I was. I wanted them to read my mind about what I wanted instead of taking a chance." This self-awareness is remarkable, even as some critics have pointed out that this framing risks minimizing the very real abuse and control she experienced. The legacy of their relationship extends far beyond just their personal story. In the Not Me Too era, their marriage has been cited as an example of the unchecked toxic masculinity and gender imbalances that were rampant in 1970s Hollywood. McQueen's King of Cool image has come under increased scrutiny, with many questioning whether his rebel persona was really just a romanticization of deeply problematic behavior: the jealousy, the control, the violence, the serial womanizing. A 2023 Reddit thread discussing MacGraw's career blamed McQueen's toxicity for what they called her career fizzle, with users pointing out how his demand that she quit acting robbed the world of what could have been decades more of performances from a talented actress at the height of her powers. The prenup clause forcing her to give up her career has been called a red flag that MacGraw herself only recognized in hindsight, and a 2025 YouTube documentary was even titled "Why Ali MacGraw Never Forgave Steve McQueen for This," though MacGraw herself has never used such definitive language about her feelings. It's also worth noting that this wasn't McQueen's first rodeo when it came to abusive behavior in relationships. His first wife, Nyla Adams, detailed far more extensive physical abuse in her 1986 memoir, including the terrifying incident where he held a loaded gun to her head and beat her after she confessed to a brief affair. Adams wrote that McQueen exacted the story of the transgression between slaps and later forced her to have an abortion because he refused to believe the child was his, leaving her to travel alone from France to Britain for the procedure while dealing with what she called the continuing physical and mental abuse. Adams attributed McQueen's behavior to his own childhood trauma, saying, "Steve had been an abused child, and often that results in an abusive parent, a cycle of violence that he never broke." It's a reminder that while understanding the roots of someone's behavior is important, it doesn't excuse the harm they cause to others. Interestingly, McQueen's third and final wife, Barbara Minty, whom he married in 1980, just months before his death, reported no abuse. Her memoir, Steve McQueen: The Last Mile, portrayed a vulnerable, cancer-stricken man seeking redemption through Bible studies, suggesting that perhaps in his final months, facing mortality, McQueen was finally attempting to become a better man. In 2025 interviews, Minty has shared reflections emphasizing his final piece, though this gentler version of McQueen stands in stark contrast to the man that both Adams and MacGraw experienced during their marriages. MacGraw's journey from that toxic relationship to sobriety and peace is inspiring, but it came at an enormous cost. Her career, years of her life, her sense of self. She has become an advocate for women's independence and authentic communication in relationships, using her own painful experiences to help others avoid the same pitfalls. A 2024 New York Times piece on MacGraw's life touched on her current perspective on aging and her past, showing a woman who has made peace with her choices even while acknowledging the pain they caused. She lives far from Hollywood now, in the high desert of New Mexico, surrounded by the animals she rescues and the quiet she once would have found boring but now cherishes. years. In reflecting on McQueen decades after his death, MacGraw said, "There were many times that were just wonderful, and there were many times that were just ghastly, and perhaps that's the most honest summation possible. Not a fairy tale, not a simple story of good versus evil, but a complicated, messy, painful human story that contains both beauty and horror, love and abuse, hope and devastation." Liked this video? Click on the card showing on your screen for more.